The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy courtyard as Elena Rodriguez walked with purpose toward the main building. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her crisp white uniform bore the insignia of a third-year cadet. At 22, she had already distinguished herself as one of the Academy's most promising students, but today would test her in ways no classroom ever could. Elena came from a family where military service wasn't just tradition, it was expectation. Her grandfather had served in World War II, her father was a decorated naval captain, and her two older brothers were both officers in active duty. The Rodriguez name carried weight in military circles, but Elena had worked twice as hard as anyone else to prove she belonged at the Academy on her own merit, not because of family connections. The Academy itself was an imposing structure, built in the 1920s with gray stone walls that seemed to absorb the morning light. Its halls had witnessed decades of naval tradition, producing officers who went on to serve in every major conflict of the 20th century. For Elena, walking these corridors felt like stepping through history, but she knew that being here as one of only 37 women in a class of 400 men meant she was part of making new history. Admiral Marcus Thornfield had been commandant of the Academy for 3 years. A tall, imposing man in his late 50s with silver hair and steely blue eyes, he commanded respect through a combination of military bearing and an intimidating presence. His office walls were lined with commendations from a distinguished career that included tours in the Pacific Fleet and strategic positions at the Pentagon. However, beneath the polished exterior of military excellence lay attitudes that belonged to a different era. Thornfield had never hidden his belief that women had no place in combat roles or positions of military leadership. He often spoke about maintaining the integrity and traditional values of the naval service. While he was careful to avoid overtly discriminatory language in official settings, his views were well known throughout the Academy. Many female cadets had learned to navigate around his prejudices, keeping their heads down and focusing on graduation. Elena had encountered the Admiral's bias firsthand during her second year. During a leadership exercise, she had proposed an innovative tactical solution that impressed her instructors. However, when the Admiral reviewed the exercise reports, he had dismissed her contribution, suggesting that women were better suited to support roles rather than strategic thinking. The comment had stung, but Elena had channeled her frustration into determination to prove him wrong. The incident that would change everything began with what seemed like a routine matter. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a recent Academy graduate and Elena's mentor, had filed a formal complaint about inappropriate conduct by several senior staff members. The complaint detailed a pattern of harassment that included unwelcome comments about women's capabilities, inappropriate touching during training exercises, and the creation of a hostile environment that made it difficult for female cadets to succeed. Elena had been one of several cadets who provided statements supporting Lieutenant Chen's complaint. She had documented specific incidents where she witnessed or experienced discriminatory treatment. Her statement was detailed and professional, focusing on facts rather than emotions. She believed that speaking up was not just about protecting herself and other women, but about upholding the honor and integrity that the Academy claimed to represent. The complaint had been submitted through proper channels and should have triggered a thorough investigation. Military protocol required that such serious allegations be handled with complete transparency and fairness. However, Elena soon learned that Admiral Thornfield had personally intervened to suppress the complaint. He had used his authority to classify the matter as internal personnel issue and ordered that no further action be taken. When Elena discovered this through a friend in the administration office, she felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. The very institution that taught honor, courage, and integrity was failing to live up to its own values. She spent several sleepless nights wrestling with what to do next. Her training had taught her to respect the chain of command, but her conscience told her that some things were more important than following orders. Elena made the difficult decision to take the matter to the Inspector General's office, which had oversight authority over the Academy. This meant bypassing Admiral Thornfield entirely and potentially ending her own naval career before it began. She knew that challenging a flag officer was considered a serious breach of military etiquette, but she also knew that staying silent would make her complicit in a system that protected harassment and discrimination. Her decision was influenced by a conversation with her father, Captain Miguel Rodriguez, during a weekend visit home. Without revealing specific details, Elena had asked him about situations where an officer might need to choose between following orders and doing what's right. Her father, a man of few words but strong principles, had told her that true honor sometimes required courage to stand against popular opinion or authority. The Inspector General's investigation moved quickly once Elena's complaint was filed. Within 2 weeks, a team of investigators arrived at the academy to conduct interviews and review documents. Elena cooperated fully, providing detailed testimony about what she had witnessed and experienced. The investigation revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended beyond Lieutenant Chen's original complaint, involving multiple incidents and several members of the senior staff. Admiral Thornfield quickly realized that Elena was the source of the external complaint. His initial response was to attempt damage control, trying to discredit her testimony by questioning her motives and suggesting that she was simply a disgruntled cadet seeking attention. However, the investigators found her account credible and well-documented, supported by testimony from other cadets and even some junior faculty members who had previously been afraid to speak up. As the investigation progressed, Admiral Thornfield's attitude toward Elena became increasingly hostile. He began finding excuses to call her into his office for minor infractions that would normally be handled by junior staff. During these meetings, he would make pointed comments about loyalty, respect for authority, and the consequences of going outside the chain of command. While he was careful not to make direct threats, the implications were clear. Elena found herself under constant scrutiny. Her performance in classes was analyzed more critically than ever before. Training exercises that she would normally excel in became opportunities for instructors aligned with the Admiral to find fault with her work. The pressure was intense, but Elena remained focused on her studies and maintained the high standards she had always set for herself. The situation reached a critical point when Admiral Thornfield called Elena to his office for what he described as a final discussion about her future at the academy. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon when most of the staff would be off duty. Elena arrived at the appointed time, knowing that this confrontation would likely determine whether she would be allowed to complete her education and pursue her dream of becoming a naval officer. The Admiral's office was a shrine to military tradition, with model ships, battle flags, and photographs of him with various dignitaries covering every available surface. Behind his massive oak desk hung a portrait of Admiral Nimitz, as if the World War II hero was watching over the proceedings. The room was designed to intimidate, and Elena felt the weight of its intended psychological impact as she entered. Admiral Thornfield kept her standing at attention for several minutes while he finished reading reports, a deliberate show of power and disrespect. When he finally looked up, his expression was cold and calculating. He began by listing Elena's failures as a cadet, minor infractions, and subjective criticisms that had been compiled over the past few weeks. His tone was measured and professional, but the underlying hostility was unmistakable. Elena listened in silence, knowing that any response would only provide him with more ammunition. She had learned that Admiral Thornfield was skilled at provoking emotional reactions that could be used to justify disciplinary action. Her strategy was to remain calm and professional, regardless of what he said or did. The Admiral's monologue gradually shifted from criticism of her performance to questioning her loyalty and integrity. He suggested that her complaint to the Inspector General showed a fundamental lack of understanding about military values and the importance of unit cohesion. His words were chosen carefully to stay within the bounds of official conduct, while making it clear that he viewed her actions as betrayal. As the meeting continued, Admiral Thornfield moved from behind his desk to stand directly in front of Elena. This invasion of personal space was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to make her feel vulnerable and off balance. His proximity was uncomfortable and inappropriate, but Elena maintained her military bearing and kept her eyes focused straight ahead. The Admiral began speaking more quietly, forcing Elena to strain to hear him. This created an artificial intimacy that felt threatening rather than conversational. He spoke about how her defiance had caused problems for everyone at the academy and suggested that she consider withdrawing voluntarily rather than facing formal disciplinary action that could affect her permanent record. Elena realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for since she first decided to speak up. Admiral Thornfield was offering her a way out that would protect his reputation while ending her military career. The choice was clear: accept defeat and abandon her dreams, or stand firm and face whatever consequences he might impose. When Elena remained silent and maintained her position, Admiral Thornfield's frustration became more evident. His professional facade began to slip as he realized that his intimidation tactics were not having the desired effect. He moved even closer, close enough that Elena could smell his cologne and feel his breath when he spoke. The Admiral's words became more personal and more threatening. He questioned whether she had the temperament for military service and suggested that women who couldn't handle criticism should find other careers. His tone had shifted from official disapproval to something that felt more like personal malice. Elena knew that she was being tested in a way that had nothing to do with her qualifications as a future naval officer and everything to do with Admiral Thornfield's need to assert dominance over someone who had challenged his authority. She understood that this moment would define not just her own future, but potentially the experiences of other women who would follow in her footsteps. The tension in the room was building toward a confrontation that would change both of their lives forever. Elena could sense that Admiral Thornfield was working up the courage to cross a line that would transform this from a professional disagreement into something much more serious. She prepared herself mentally for whatever was about to happen, drawing on her training and her inner strength to face the challenge ahead. The silence in Admiral Thornfield's office stretched uncomfortably as Elena maintained her rigid stance at attention. Outside, the academy grounds were quiet except for the distant sound of cadets returning from afternoon training exercises. Inside the office, the atmosphere had become electric with tension, as if the air itself was charged with the possibility of violence. Admiral Thornfield circled Elena slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. His footsteps on the polished floor seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Each step was deliberate and measured, designed to increase psychological pressure and demonstrate his complete control over the situation. Elena kept her eyes fixed on a point on the wall, following military protocol even as every instinct told her that this confrontation was moving beyond anything resembling normal disciplinary procedure. The Admiral stopped directly in front of Elena again, close enough that she could see the network of small veins around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his anger despite his controlled demeanor. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, forcing her to concentrate to understand his words. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" Admiral Thornfield asked, his tone mixing disappointment with something more dangerous. 27 years I've served this institution. 27 years of building something great, something pure. And you think you can waltz in here with your complaints and your accusations and tear it all down? Elena remained silent, though every word felt like a physical blow. She understood that he wasn't really asking questions that required answers. This was a monologue designed to justify whatever action he was planning to take. Her silence seemed to frustrate him further, as he was clearly expecting some kind of response that would allow him to escalate the situation. Admiral Thornfield moved to the window overlooking the academy grounds. From this position, he could see the parade field where generations of naval officers had learned drill and ceremony. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured grass, and a few groundskeepers were preparing for the next day's activities. The peaceful scene outside contrasted sharply with the growing tension inside the office. "Do you see that?" the Admiral asked, gesturing toward the window. "Every morning, 500 cadets march across that field. They learn discipline, honor, respect for authority. They learn what it means to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's what we build here, not just officers, but leaders who understand sacrifice and duty." Elena continued to maintain her position, though she could feel sweat beginning to form on her forehead despite the air conditioning. The Admiral's words were building towards something, and she sensed that he was trying to rationalize his actions in advance. This was a technique she had learned about in psychology classes, the way people convince themselves that harmful actions are justified by higher principles. Admiral Thornfield turned away from the window and walked to his desk, where he picked up a folder containing what Elena recognized as her personnel file. He opened it slowly and began reading from various documents, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Elena Rodriguez," he began formally. "Third-year cadet, originally from San Diego, California. Daughter of Captain Miguel Rodriguez, currently serving as executive officer aboard the USS Constellation. Sister to Lieutenant Commander David Rodriguez and Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez. A family with distinguished service record." The Admiral paused and looked up from the file, his expression calculating. Elena realized that he was reminding her of how much she had to lose, not just her own career, but potentially the reputations of her family members who were still serving. The implication was clear. her actions could have consequences that extended far beyond herself. Your father and I served together briefly about 15 years ago, Admiral Thornfield continued conversationally. Good officer, strong leader. He trained you well. I can see his influence in your bearing, your discipline. It's a shame that his daughter lacks his judgment about when to speak and when to remain silent. Elena felt a flash of anger at the insult to her family, but she channeled it into determination to remain professional. She understood that Admiral Thornfield was trying to provoke an emotional response that would justify whatever punishment he had planned. Her best defense was to refuse to give him the reaction he wanted. The Admiral closed the personnel file and walked around his desk again. This time, he approached Elena from the side, moving into her peripheral vision in a way that felt deliberately invasive. His presence beside her was uncomfortable and inappropriate, violating the normal boundaries of military protocol. I've been thinking about your future, Miss Rodriguez, Admiral Thornfield said, his voice taking on a false tone of concern. The Inspector General's investigation is proceeding, and, regardless of the outcome, there will be consequences. Some people might see you as a hero, standing up for what's right. Others will see you as someone who can't be trusted to work within the system. Elena understood the subtext clearly. Admiral Thornfield was warning her that even if the investigation vindicated her complaint, she would face informal retaliation throughout her career. The military was a small community where reputations followed officers from assignment to assignment. A reputation as someone who couldn't handle problems internally could effectively end her prospects for advancement. The Admiral continued his psychological assault, describing in detail how difficult life could become for an officer who was perceived as disloyal or troublesome. He spoke about assignments to remote locations, difficulties getting promoted, and the social isolation that came with being marked as a whistleblower. His words painted a picture of a career filled with frustration and unfulfilled potential. Elena listened to this litany of threats while maintaining her military bearing, but inside she was processing the deeper implications of what Admiral Thornfield was revealing. His detailed knowledge of how the system could be used to punish those who spoke up suggested that he had used these tactics before. Her complaint was probably not the first time he had faced challenges to his authority. The realization that other women might have been silenced through similar intimidation tactics strengthened Elena's resolve. She began to understand that this confrontation was about much more than her individual case. Admiral Thornfield represented a system that protected itself by crushing those who challenged it, and her response would determine whether that pattern continued. Admiral Thornfield seemed to sense that his threats were not having the desired effect. His tone began to shift from disappointed authority figure to something more personal and more dangerous. He moved closer to Elena, close enough that his proximity became physically uncomfortable. You know what your real problem is? Admiral Thornfield asked, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that felt completely inappropriate. You think you're special. You think that because you can march and salute and follow orders, you belong here. But this institution was built by men who understood sacrifice, who understood that some things are more important than individual feelings or personal ambition. Elena could feel Admiral Thornfield's breath on her neck as he spoke. The invasion of her personal space was clearly deliberate, designed to make her feel vulnerable and powerless. She understood that this was a form of assault, using physical intimidation to reinforce psychological dominance. The Admiral's hand moved toward Elena's shoulder, ostensibly to adjust something about her uniform, but actually to establish physical contact that would demonstrate his power over her. Elena could see his reflection in the glass of a framed photograph on the wall, and she watched his approach with growing alarm. Maybe we can work something out, Admiral Thornfield said, his voice taking on a tone that suggested possibilities beyond the immediate conversation. You're a bright young woman with a promising future. It would be a shame to see that potential wasted because of a misunderstanding about how things work around here. Elena understood exactly what kind of arrangement Admiral Thornfield was suggesting. His words and actions were building toward a proposition that would be both illegal and completely contrary to everything the military claimed to represent. She realized that this was probably his standard approach to dealing with women who challenged his authority. Intimidation followed by inappropriate offers of protection in exchange for silence and compliance. The moment of physical contact came suddenly. Admiral Thornfield placed his hand on Elena's shoulder with more force than necessary, ostensibly to turn her to face him, but actually to demonstrate his physical dominance. The touch was unwelcome, inappropriate, and designed to make her feel powerless. Elena's training kicked in immediately. Years of self-defense instruction, combat training, and leadership development had prepared her for situations where she might need to protect herself. More importantly, her moral training had prepared her to recognize when someone was using their position of authority to commit acts that violated everything the military claimed to stand for. The touch on her shoulder lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for Elena to understand that Admiral Thornfield had crossed a line from which there would be no return. His actions had moved beyond inappropriate language or psychological intimidation into the realm of physical assault. The situation had become dangerous not just for her career, but for her personal safety. Admiral Thornfield's grip on Elena's shoulder tightened as he attempted to turn her to face him. His intention was clearly to establish eye contact that would reinforce his dominance while making his offer more explicit. Elena could see in his expression that he expected her to submit to his authority and accept whatever arrangement he proposed. Instead, Elena made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Drawing on her training in hand-to-hand combat and her deep reservoir of inner strength, she prepared to respond to Admiral Thornfield's aggression with precisely the kind of decisive action that the Academy had trained her to take in threatening situations. The irony was not lost on Elena that she was about to use skills taught at the Naval Academy to defend herself against the Academy's own commandant. Everything she had learned about leadership, courage, and moral responsibility was converging in this single moment when she would have to choose between submission and resistance. Admiral Thornfield was so confident in his position of power that he didn't recognize the danger he was placing himself in. He saw Elena as just another young woman who could be intimidated into silence through a combination of threats and inappropriate advances. He had no idea that he was about to discover just how wrong his assumptions were. The confrontation that had been building for weeks was about to reach its climax, and the outcome would have consequences far beyond this office, far beyond the Academy, and far beyond either of their individual careers. Elena was about to prove that some lines should never be crossed, regardless of rank, authority, or tradition. The moment Admiral Thornfield's hand tightened on Elena's shoulder, and he began to pull her toward him, time seemed to slow down. Elena could feel her heart rate increase as her body prepared for action. Every muscle tensed as her training took over, pushing aside fear and uncertainty in favor of precise, calculated response. Admiral Thornfield was expecting compliance. His experience with intimidation had taught him that most people, especially those with something to lose, would submit when faced with a combination of authority and physical aggression. He had miscalculated completely, failing to recognize that Elena Rodriguez was not most people, and that her military training had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. Elena's response was swift and devastating. Using a technique learned in hand-to-hand combat classes, she grabbed Admiral Thornfield's wrist with her left hand while simultaneously driving her right elbow backward into his solar plexus. The strike was precise and powerful, delivered with the full force of her training and the fury of her righteous anger. Admiral Thornfield doubled over immediately, gasping for breath as the impact drove the air from his lungs. His grip on Elena's shoulder released instantly as his body's automatic response to the blow took over. The surprise and shock on his face were complete. He had never imagined that his victim would fight back, much less with such skill and effectiveness. Elena stepped away from Admiral Thornfield and turned to face him, her body still in a defensive stance. She watched as he struggled to catch his breath, one hand pressed against his chest where her elbow had connected. The powerful, intimidating figure who had been terrorizing her just moments before now looked small and vulnerable, bent over and wheezing. The silence in the office was broken only by Admiral Thornfield's labored breathing and the distant sound of activity from elsewhere in the building. Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as adrenaline flooded her system. She knew that she had just committed an act that would be viewed as assault on a superior officer. But she also knew that she had defended herself against an attack that was both criminal and completely contrary to military values. Admiral Thornfield slowly straightened up, his face flushed red with a combination of physical pain and humiliation. The careful composure he had maintained throughout their confrontation was completely shattered. Elena could see in his eyes that he was processing not just the physical shock of being struck, but the psychological shock of having his assumptions about power and control proved completely wrong. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Admiral Thornfield wheezed, his voice hoarse from the impact to his diaphragm. He was trying to reassert his authority through threats, but the effect was undermined by his obvious physical distress. Elena could see that he was struggling not just with pain, but with the realization that his attempt at intimidation had backfired spectacularly. Elena remained in her defensive stance, ready to respond if Admiral Thornfield made any move to continue his attack. Her training had taught her that the first strike was often not the last in a physical confrontation, and she was prepared to defend herself further if necessary. However, she could see that Admiral Thornfield was more concerned with his bruised dignity than with continuing the physical altercation. "I defended myself against an assault," Elena replied calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "You placed your hands on me without permission and attempted to use your position of authority to coerce me into an inappropriate relationship. That's sexual harassment and assault, and I responded appropriately to protect myself." The clarity of Elena's statement seemed to penetrate Admiral Thornfield's anger and help him understand the full implications of what had just occurred. Not only had his intimidation tactic failed completely, but Elena had correctly identified his actions as criminal behavior. Any investigation of this incident would focus not on her defensive response, but on his inappropriate conduct that precipitated it. Admiral Thornfield moved slowly to his desk chair and sat down heavily, still holding his chest. Elena could see him calculating his options and realizing that most of them were unpalatable. He had intended to intimidate her into silence, but instead had created a situation where his own misconduct would be the focus of attention. Elena maintained her position near the office door, ready to leave if Admiral Thornfield dismissed her or to defend herself if he made any additional threatening moves. She was acutely aware that their confrontation was far from over, and that the consequences of the next few minutes would determine how this situation resolved. The Admiral's breathing gradually returned to normal, though Elena could see that he was still in considerable discomfort. More importantly, she could see him struggling with the realization that his carefully constructed image of authority and control had been shattered by a third-year cadet who refused to be intimidated. "Sit down," Admiral Thornfield ordered, gesturing toward a chair in front of his desk. His voice was still strained, but he was attempting to reassert control over the situation. Elena recognized this as an attempt to return to the formal structure of military hierarchy, where he could use his rank to dictate the terms of their interaction. Elena remained standing. "With respect, sir, I prefer to stand." Her response was polite but firm, making it clear that she would not automatically defer to his authority after he had abused it so egregiously. The subtle defiance in her stance communicated that their relationship had fundamentally changed, and that she would not pretend otherwise. Admiral Thornfield stared at Elena for a long moment, perhaps finally beginning to understand the kind of person he was dealing with. Elena Rodriguez was not someone who could be bullied into submission through threats or physical intimidation. Her willingness to file the initial complaint, her composure under pressure, and her effective self-defense all demonstrated a strength of character that he had underestimated. "What happens next?" Admiral Thornfield asked, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to understand that Elena now held significant power in their relationship. The reversal was complete. The person who had entered his office as a subordinate facing disciplinary action was now someone whose decisions would determine his future. Elena considered her response carefully. She understood that her next words would set the tone for everything that followed. Admiral Thornfield was clearly hoping that she might be willing to keep this incident between them. But Elena had no intention of protecting someone who had used his position to commit assault and harassment. "What happens next is that I report this incident to the Inspector General's office as part of their ongoing investigation," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "Your attempt to intimidate me into withdrawing my complaint, combined with your physical assault, provides additional evidence of the pattern of misconduct that we've been documenting." Admiral Thornfield's face paled as he realized that Elena intended to report his actions rather than remain silent. He had assumed that the shame and potential career damage of being involved in such an incident would motivate her to keep quiet. Instead, he was discovering that Elena viewed reporting his misconduct as a moral obligation rather than a personal choice. "You have no proof of what happened here," Admiral Thornfield said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was grasping for ways to minimize the damage, but Elena could see that he understood the weakness of his position. Her word against his might have been problematic under normal circumstances, but given the existing investigation and the physical evidence of their altercation, her account would likely be believed. Elena looked pointedly at the security camera mounted in the corner of Admiral Thornfield's office. Like most administrative spaces in the Academy, the office was equipped with surveillance equipment that recorded both audio and video. While the camera angle might not have captured every detail of their interaction, it would certainly have recorded enough to corroborate Elena's account of events. Admiral Thornfield followed Elena's gaze to the camera, and his expression shifted to one of resignation. He had forgotten about the surveillance system in his own office, so focused on intimidating Elena that he had ignored the fact that his actions were being recorded. The irony was bitter. The security system designed to protect Academy property had instead documented his criminal behavior. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside reminded both Elena and Admiral Thornfield that they were not alone in the building. Other staff members were still working, and their confrontation had probably lasted longer than either of them had realized. Elena was acutely aware that someone might knock on the door at any moment, potentially walking into a situation that would require immediate explanation. Admiral Thornfield seemed to realize this as well, and Elena could see him calculating how to handle the immediate aftermath of their altercation. His uniform was disheveled from their physical encounter, and his face still showed the effects of being struck. Anyone who saw him would immediately recognize that something significant had occurred. Elena straightened her own uniform, which had been slightly disturbed during the confrontation. She wanted to ensure that she looked professional and composed when she left Admiral Thornfield's office. Her ability to maintain military bearing despite the traumatic nature of their encounter would be important evidence of her credibility and character. "I'll be filing my supplemental report with the Inspector General within the hour," Elena informed Admiral Thornfield. "I'll also be requesting immediate medical documentation of any injuries from this assault, as well as preservation of the security footage that recorded your actions." The methodical way Elena outlined her next steps demonstrated that she was thinking clearly about the legal and administrative requirements for properly documenting what had occurred. Admiral Thornfield could see that she was not acting emotionally or impulsively, but rather following established procedures for reporting criminal behavior. Admiral Thornfield made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Cadet Rodriguez, I think you're misinterpreting what happened here. This was simply a discussion that became somewhat heated. Perhaps we should both take some time to consider whether formal reports are really necessary." Elena's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Sir, you physically assaulted me after making inappropriate advances. There is no interpretation required, and no amount of time will change what occurred. I will be reporting this incident through proper channels, and I expect that you will be held accountable for your actions." The finality in Elena's voice seemed to drain the last of Admiral Thornfield's resistance. He slumped in his chair, perhaps finally, understanding that his career was effectively over. The investigation that had begun with Elena's complaint about harassment and discrimination had now documented actual criminal behavior by the Academy's most senior officer. Elena moved toward the office door, ready to leave and begin the process of formal reporting. She paused with her hand on the door handle and looked back at Admiral Thornfield, who was staring blankly at his desk. Despite everything he had done, she felt a moment of pity for how completely his world was about to change. "For what it's worth, sir," Elena said quietly, "this didn't have to happen this way. If you had simply followed proper procedures and allowed the original investigation to proceed fairly, we wouldn't be here right now." Admiral Thornfield looked up at Elena with an expression that seemed to combine regret, anger, and resignation. "You have no idea what you've set in motion," he said softly. "This goes far beyond just my career or your complaint. You're about to learn how the system really works, and it's not going to be pleasant for anyone involved." Elena met his gaze steadily. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. Maybe the system needs to change, and maybe it takes someone willing to face the consequences to make that change possible. With that, Elena opened the door and stepped into the hallway, leaving Admiral Thornfield alone in his office to contemplate the wreckage of his career and reputation. She walked calmly toward the main entrance of the building, her mind already focused on the tasks ahead: medical documentation, formal reports, and the long process of seeking justice through official channels. Behind her, Admiral Thornfield sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that Elena Rodriguez was not just another cadet who could be intimidated into submission. She was someone who possessed the courage and integrity to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. His attempt to silence her had instead ensured that his misconduct would be exposed to the full scrutiny of military justice. Elena walked through the academy corridors with steady, purposeful steps, though her mind was racing with the implications of what had just occurred. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows on the polished floors, and the normal sounds of academy life seemed muted and distant. She was acutely aware that everything about her life was about to change, but she was determined to handle the situation with the same professionalism and integrity that had brought her to this point. Her first stop was the academy's medical facility, where she requested an immediate examination and documentation of any injuries resulting from Admiral Thornfield's assault. The duty nurse, Lieutenant Patricia Walsh, was initially puzzled by the request, but her expression grew serious as Elena explained that she needed medical documentation for an official complaint involving assault by a superior officer. Lieutenant Walsh conducted a thorough examination, documenting the bruising on Elena's shoulder where Admiral Thornfield had grabbed her, as well as minor abrasions on her knuckles from the defensive strike she had delivered. The nurse took photographs and completed detailed written documentation, following established protocols for cases involving potential criminal behavior. Throughout the examination, Elena remained calm and professional, answering questions factually and without emotion. Cadet Rodriguez, Lieutenant Walsh said as she completed her documentation, "I need you to understand that filing this report will trigger mandatory notification procedures. The Academy administration will be informed within the hour, and this matter will receive immediate attention from senior officials." Elena nodded her understanding. "I'm aware of the procedures, ma'am. I'll be filing additional reports with the Inspector General's office, and potentially with civilian law enforcement as well." This incident occurred in the context of an ongoing investigation into misconduct by Academy leadership. Lieutenant Walsh's expression showed recognition of the serious nature of Elena's situation. As a naval officer herself, she understood the courage required to file complaints against superior officers, especially flag-rank officials like Admiral Thornfield. She completed her documentation with extra care, knowing that it might become evidence in criminal proceedings. Elena's next stop was the Inspector General's office, where she met with Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the senior investigator handling her original complaint. Morrison was a career military lawyer with extensive experience in misconduct investigations, and he immediately recognized the significance of Elena's supplemental report. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Morrison said after Elena had provided a detailed account of the afternoon's events. "Admiral Thornfield called you to his office ostensibly for a disciplinary meeting, but instead attempted to intimidate you into withdrawing your complaint, then physically assaulted you when his intimidation failed?" Elena confirmed Morrison's summary, providing additional details about Admiral Thornfield's specific threats regarding her career prospects and his inappropriate physical contact. She also informed Morrison about the security camera in the Admiral's office, which should have recorded the entire incident. Morrison immediately began the process of securing the security footage, knowing that it would provide crucial corroborating evidence for Elena's account. He also initiated procedures to ensure Admiral Thornfield could not destroy or alter any potential evidence, including ordering immediate preservation of all electronic records and communications related to the case. The investigation team worked efficiently to gather evidence throughout the evening and into the night. The security footage from Admiral Thornfield's office provided clear documentation of his inappropriate behavior, including the moment when he placed his hands on Elena without permission and her immediate defensive response. The audio quality was sufficient to capture much of their conversation, including his threats about her career prospects and his inappropriate suggestions. Word of the incident spread quickly through the Academy's senior staff, creating an atmosphere of shock and uncertainty. Many faculty members had worked with Admiral Thornfield for years and were struggling to reconcile the criminal behavior documented in Elena's report with their previous impressions of his character. Others, particularly female faculty members, privately acknowledged that they had witnessed concerning behavior, but had never felt empowered to speak up. By morning, news of Admiral Thornfield's assault on Elena had reached the highest levels of Naval Command. The Chief of Naval Operations Office was notified, as was the Secretary of the Navy. An incident involving criminal assault by a flag officer against a cadet was unprecedented in recent naval history and required immediate attention from senior leadership. Elena found herself at the center of a media storm as news of the incident became public. Military Times, Navy Times, and other defense publications picked up the story, followed quickly by mainstream media outlets. The narrative of a female cadet fighting back against assault by a male admiral captured public attention and sparked national conversations about military culture and gender discrimination. The academy was placed under intense scrutiny as reporters and investigators descended on the campus. Elena was assigned protective details to ensure her safety and to prevent unauthorized contact with media representatives. The Academy's Public Affairs Office struggled to manage the crisis while maintaining operational security and protecting the integrity of ongoing investigations. Admiral Thornfield was immediately relieved of command pending the outcome of the investigation. He was escorted from his office by military police and confined to quarters while formal charges were prepared. The speed of his removal from authority demonstrated that senior naval leadership took the allegations seriously and would not tolerate any appearance of protecting criminal behavior. Elena continued attending classes and participating in academy activities, though she was acutely aware of the attention her case was receiving. Some cadets treated her as a hero for standing up against abuse of power, while others viewed her actions as disloyal to military tradition. The divided reactions reflected broader cultural tensions within the military about gender equality and institutional change. The formal charges against Admiral Thornfield were filed within a week of the incident. In addition to assault and sexual harassment, he faced charges of abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and obstruction of justice for his attempts to suppress the original investigation. The charges carried potential penalties including dismissal from service, forfeiture of retirement benefits, and civilian criminal prosecution. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's investigation expanded to examine the broader culture of harassment and discrimination at the academy. Elena's courage in speaking up had encouraged other cadets and faculty members to come forward with their own accounts of misconduct. The investigation revealed a pattern of inappropriate behavior that extended far beyond Admiral Thornfield's individual actions. Elena worked closely with the investigation team, providing detailed testimony and helping to identify other potential victims and witnesses. She approached this responsibility with the same dedication and professionalism she brought to her academic work, understanding that her cooperation was essential for ensuring that justice was served and that meaningful reforms were implemented. The media attention surrounding Elena's case sparked congressional interest in military academy culture and oversight procedures. Senate and House committees announced hearings on sexual assault and harassment in military educational institutions, with Elena scheduled to provide testimony about her experiences and recommendations for institutional reform. Elena's family rallied around her during this difficult period. Her father, Captain Miguel Rodriguez, took emergency leave to provide support and guidance. Despite the potential impact on his own career from his daughter's high-profile case, Captain Rodriguez expressed complete pride in Elena's courage and integrity. Her brothers also provided emotional support, helping her navigate the complex pressures of media attention and legal proceedings. The Academy's interim leadership, headed by Rear Admiral Catherine Sullivan, began implementing immediate reforms to address the cultural problems revealed by the investigation. New policies were established for reporting misconduct, protecting whistleblowers, and ensuring that complaints receive proper investigation regardless of the rank of accused individuals. Elena found herself serving as an unofficial advisor to the reform process, providing insights based on her experiences as a female cadet and her observations of academy culture. Her recommendations focused on creating accountability mechanisms, improving training about appropriate conduct, and establishing clear consequences for violations of professional standards. The broader naval community watched Elena's case closely, recognizing that the outcome would set important precedents for how the service handled misconduct by senior officials. Many junior officers saw Elena's actions as a positive step toward institutional accountability, while some senior officers worried about the impact on military hierarchy and discipline. Elena's academic performance remained strong despite the intense pressures surrounding her case. Her professors noted her continued dedication to her studies and her ability to maintain focus on her goal of becoming a naval officer. This professional competence under extreme stress demonstrated the leadership qualities that had originally brought her to the Academy's attention. The court-martial proceedings against Admiral Thornfield were scheduled for the following semester, with Elena expected to serve as the primary witness for the prosecution. She prepared thoroughly for her testimony, working with military lawyers to ensure that her account of events would be clear, compelling, and legally sufficient to support criminal conviction. Support groups for Elena emerged both within the academy and among military families nationwide. Many women who had experienced similar harassment or discrimination saw Elena as a symbol of hope that the military was finally serious about addressing these problems. Their letters and messages provided Elena with strength during particularly difficult moments. The Secretary of the Navy announced the establishment of a comprehensive review of military academy policies and procedures, with Elena's case serving as a catalyst for examining institutional practices that had previously been considered untouchable. The review would examine everything from admissions procedures to disciplinary policies to ensure that military academies truly embodied the values they claimed to teach. Elena's case also attracted attention from civilian organizations focused on gender equality and workplace harassment. Legal scholars analyzed the case as an example of how institutions could be forced to confront systemic problems through the courage of individual whistleblowers. Elena found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of a national symbol for broader social change. The international military community also followed Elena's case with interest, as many allied nations faced similar challenges with gender integration and institutional culture change. Elena received messages of support from female military officers around the world who saw her actions as advancing the cause of equality and professionalism in armed forces globally. As the investigation continued to unfold, Elena remained focused on her ultimate goal of completing her education and earning her commission as a naval officer. She understood that her actions had created opportunities for positive change throughout the military, but she was determined not to let the attention distract her from her personal mission of serving her country with honor and distinction. The academy itself was transformed by Elena's case, with new leadership implementing comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future incidents of harassment and discrimination. The changes included revised reporting procedures, enhanced training programs, and cultural initiatives designed to create an environment where all cadets could succeed regardless of gender or background. Elena's courage had set in motion a series of events that would reshape military culture and accountability for years to come. What began as one cadet's decision to speak up about harassment had evolved into a national conversation about institutional responsibility, personal courage, and the true meaning of military honor and integrity. The court-martial of Admiral Marcus Thornfield began on a cold February morning 6 months after Elena's confrontation with him in his office. The proceedings were held at the Washington Navy Yard, in a courtroom that had witnessed numerous high-profile military trials throughout its history. The gravity of the situation was evident from the moment Elena entered the building. This was the first time in decades that a flag officer faced criminal charges for assault against a subordinate. Elena had spent weeks preparing for her testimony, working with military prosecutors to ensure that her account would be clear, compelling, and legally sufficient. She understood that her credibility would be central to the case, and that Admiral Thornfield's defense team would likely attempt to portray her as a disgruntled cadet seeking attention or revenge. Her preparation focused on presenting facts objectively while conveying the serious impact of his actions. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, military officials, and observers from various advocacy organizations. Elena's family sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, their presence providing emotional support during what she knew would be the most challenging testimony of her life. Her father, Captain Miguel Rodriguez, wore his dress uniform as a show of support for both his daughter and the military justice system. Admiral Thornfield entered the courtroom flanked by his defense attorneys, civilian lawyers who specialized in military criminal law. He appeared thinner and older than Elena remembered, the stress of the past months having taken an obvious toll on his appearance. When their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, Elena felt no satisfaction at his reduced circumstances, only determination to ensure that justice was served. The prosecution's opening statement outlined a clear narrative of abuse of power, sexual harassment, and assault. The lead prosecutor, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, methodically described how Admiral Thornfield had used his position of authority to intimidate Elena and ultimately assault her when his psychological tactics failed. The prosecution emphasized that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of misconduct that violated everything the military claimed to represent. The defense team's opening statement attempted to portray Admiral Thornfield as a dedicated officer whose career had been destroyed by a misunderstanding that escalated beyond reason. They argued that Elena had misinterpreted professional criticism as harassment and had responded to a minor physical contact with excessive force. Their strategy was to minimize the severity of Admiral Thornfield's actions while emphasizing the damage to his reputation and career. Elena's testimony began on the second day of the trial. She took the witness stand wearing her dress blue uniform, her bearing reflecting the military professionalism that had characterized her response throughout the entire ordeal. The prosecutor began with background questions about Elena's education, family military service, and exemplary record at the academy, establishing her credibility and character. The detailed account of Elena's interactions with Admiral Thornfield began with her original complaint about harassment and discrimination. She described the pattern of retaliation that followed her decision to file the complaint with the Inspector General's office, including increased scrutiny of her performance and hostile comments from Academy staff aligned with the Admiral. Elena's description of the final confrontation in Admiral Thornfield's office was calm and factual, but the impact on everyone in the courtroom was electric. She described Admiral Thornfield's escalating threats, his inappropriate physical proximity, and the moment when he grabbed her shoulder and attempted to coerce her into an inappropriate relationship. Her account of defending herself was matter of fact, emphasizing that her response was proportional and necessary to protect herself from further assault. The cross-examination by Admiral Thornfield's defense team was aggressive but respectful, recognizing that attacking Elena's character too harshly would likely backfire with the military jury. The defense attorney focused on suggesting that Elena had misinterpreted Admiral Thornfield's intentions and had responded with excessive force to what was merely an inappropriate gesture rather than a serious assault. Elena's responses during cross-examination demonstrated the poise and intelligence that had made her one of the Academy's top cadets. She acknowledged that military training included preparation for physical contact and conflict, but emphasized that such training also taught appropriate responses to different types of threats. Her decision to defend herself had been based on Admiral Thornfield's clear intent to commit assault, not on any misunderstanding of his actions. The security footage from Admiral Thornfield's office proved to be the most damaging evidence against him. The video clearly showed his inappropriate behavior, including the moment when he grabbed Elena's shoulder and her immediate defensive response. The audio quality was sufficient to capture his threats about her career and his inappropriate suggestions, contradicting defense claims that their interaction was merely a professional disagreement. Expert testimony from military legal scholars and psychologists provided context for understanding the power dynamics at play in Elena's case. Dr. Margaret Foster, a specialist in military culture and gender issues, explained how institutional hierarchies could be used to silence victims of harassment and assault. Her testimony helped the jury understand why Elena's willingness to speak up represented extraordinary courage rather than disloyalty. Additional witnesses included other cadets and faculty members who testified about the culture of intimidation that Admiral Thornfield had created at the Academy. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, whose original complaint had started the investigation, described similar intimidation tactics that Admiral Thornfield had used against her. These testimonies established a pattern of misconduct that supported Elena's account of events. Character witnesses for Admiral Thornfield included several senior officers who testified about his distinguished military service and previous exemplary conduct. However, their testimony was undermined by cross-examination that revealed how the military's culture of protecting senior officers had allowed inappropriate behavior to continue unchecked for years. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized that Admiral Thornfield's military service record, however distinguished, could not excuse criminal behavior. Lieutenant Colonel Kim argued that holding senior officers accountable for their actions was essential for maintaining the integrity of military institutions and protecting those who served under their command. The defense's closing argument focused on the disparity between Admiral Thornfield's decades of service and Elena's relative inexperience, suggesting that her interpretation of events had been influenced by contemporary sensitivity about gender issues rather than objective assessment of Admiral Thornfield's actions. However, this approach seemed to backfire with the jury, which included both male and female officers who understood the seriousness of assault regardless of the victim's rank or experience. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. Elena waited in a nearby conference room with her family and the prosecution team, trying to focus on her studies but finding concentration difficult. She understood that the verdict would not only determine Admiral Thornfield's fate, but would send a message about the military's commitment to protecting those who reported misconduct. When the jury returned with their verdict, The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Elena sat with the prosecution team, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the tension she felt. Admiral Thornfield stood as the verdict was read, his expression revealing nothing about his inner state. The jury found Admiral Thornfield guilty on all charges: assault, sexual harassment, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and obstruction of justice. The conviction was unanimous, reflecting the jury's conclusion that Elena's testimony and the supporting evidence had proven the charges beyond reasonable doubt. The sentencing phase of the trial focused on the appropriate punishment for Admiral Thornfield's crimes. The prosecution argued for dismissal from service, forfeiture of retirement benefits, and confinement, emphasizing that senior officers must be held to the highest standards of conduct. The defense sought leniency based on Admiral Thornfield's previous service record and the impact that severe punishment would have on his family. Elena was asked to provide a victim impact statement during the sentencing phase. She chose to focus not on the personal impact of Admiral Thornfield's assault, but on the broader implications for military culture and institutional integrity. She spoke about the importance of holding leaders accountable and creating an environment where all service members could serve with dignity and respect. Admiral Thornfield was sentenced to dismissal from service, forfeiture of all retirement benefits, and 6 months of confinement. The sentence was severe by military standards, reflecting the jury's view that his abuse of authority and assault on a subordinate represented serious crimes that demanded serious consequences. The immediate aftermath of the trial brought mixed reactions from the military community. Many officers, particularly women and younger service members, viewed the conviction as a positive step toward accountability and institutional reform. However, some senior officers worried about the impact on military discipline and hierarchy, expressing concern about the precedent set by Elena's successful prosecution of a flag officer. Elena returned to the academy to complete her final year, finding that her experience had transformed not only her own perspective but the entire institutional culture. The new leadership had implemented comprehensive reforms addressing harassment, discrimination, and accountability. Training programs emphasized respect, professionalism, and the importance of creating inclusive environments for all service members. The national media attention surrounding Elena's case had sparked broader conversations about military culture and gender equality. Congressional hearings led to legislative changes requiring enhanced oversight of military academies and stricter accountability measures for senior officers. Elena found herself reluctantly thrust into the role of advocate for institutional reform, speaking at conferences and serving on committees focused on military culture change. Elena's academic performance remained exemplary throughout the trial proceedings and its aftermath. Her professors noted that the experience seemed to have strengthened rather than distracted her, demonstrating the leadership qualities that would serve her well as a naval officer. She graduated magna cum laude and was selected for one of the most competitive initial assignments available to new officers. The Academy established the Elena Rodriguez Center for Military Ethics and Leadership, recognizing her courage in speaking up against misconduct and her role in catalyzing institutional reform. The center would focus on training future officers in ethical decision-making, accountability, and the importance of protecting institutional integrity even when doing so required personal courage. Elena's commissioning ceremony was attended by senior officers from throughout the naval service, including the Chief of Naval Operations, who personally congratulated her on her courage and integrity. In his remarks, he emphasized that Elena represented the best of military values and that her actions had strengthened rather than weakened military institutions by holding them accountable to their stated principles. Admiral Thornfield served his confinement and was released from military service in disgrace. The conviction effectively ended any possibility of rehabilitation or return to public service. His case became a cautionary tale taught in military ethics courses, illustrating how the abuse of authority could destroy even the most distinguished careers. Elena's first assignment was aboard the USS Constitution, a guided missile destroyer where she served as a junior officer in the operations department. Her commanding officer, Captain Lisa Martinez, had specifically requested Elena's assignment, recognizing that her experience and character would make her a valuable addition to the crew. Elena approached her duties with the same professionalism and dedication that had characterized her response to Admiral Thornfield's misconduct. The broader impact of Elena's case continued to unfold over the following years. Military academies across all services implemented similar reforms, and the culture of protecting senior officers from accountability began to change. Elena's courage had demonstrated that institutional integrity was more important than institutional loyalty, and that true military honor required the courage to speak truth to power. Elena's story became required reading in military leadership courses, illustrating the importance of moral courage and the responsibility of all service members to protect institutional values. Her example inspired a new generation of officers who understood that true loyalty to the military required holding it accountable to its highest ideals rather than protecting it from legitimate criticism. Years later, as Elena advanced through the ranks and took on increasing leadership responsibilities, she continued to advocate for accountability and institutional integrity. Her experience had taught her that meaningful change required both individual courage and systemic reform, and she worked throughout her career to create environments where all service members could thrive regardless of gender, background, or any other personal characteristics. The transformation that began with Elena's decision to speak up about harassment had evolved into lasting institutional change that protected countless future service members from similar misconduct. Her courage had proven that one person's willingness to stand up for what was right could create ripple effects that changed entire institutions for the better. Admiral Thornfield's attempt to silence her through intimidation and assault had instead ensured that his misconduct was exposed, and that meaningful reforms were implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future.